Welcome to the Family.Inc Expert Interviews. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Janet Arzt, the founder and managing partner of Parere Advisory, an independent consulting firm advising family offices on infrastructure, development, and strategy. Parere Advisory specializes in discovering, reviewing, and presenting infrastructure options while serving as a primary point of contact for the family during all stages of the office development. Parere Advisory has advised multi-generational, as well as newly formed family offices in the development of areas such as operations, governance, and investment strategies. Prior to founding Parere Advisory, Janet served as the Chief Executive Officer of a newly launched family office in Charlottesville, Virginia, right here, where she built out and oversaw investments in operations for the family and its businesses. Prior to joining the family office, Janet served as president of Mudrick Capital Management, a $3.5 billion distressed debt hedge fund based in New York City, where she oversaw all non-investment functions and was responsible for leading strategic initiatives. Janet has also held various roles at other investment firms, including multi-strategy hedge fund, York Capital Management, and investment advisor Morgan Creek Capital Management. She began her Wall Street career in the investment banking program at Merrill Lynch after receiving a BS in Commerce from the McIntire School of Commerce at the University of Virginia here in Charlottesville. Janet is also a member of Young Presidents Organization and a contributor to Forbes.com. In 2020, Janet was named one of the top 50 leading women in hedge funds by the Hedge Fund Journal in association with Ernst & Young. Janet serves on the board of directors for nonprofits AIR NYC and the National Charitable Endowment, and is also a guest lecturer at the McIntire School of Commerce at the University of Virginia. Janet also holds the Chartered Financial Analyst designation. That's it. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Today's discussion is titled The Family Office Playbook, Structuring for Success. Quick housekeeping before we begin. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So, Janet, I just got back from Dallas, met with a number of family offices, each of them as unique as the families that started them. Let's talk about the different types of family offices. Why does a family start an office, and what are the benefits?
Yeah, so there's generally two categories that we see, right? There is what we call more the informal embedded family office, which usually sits inside an operating company or alongside of an operating company, where most of the family's interest, both financial interest and business interest, remain in that operating business. So the family office function is served oftentimes by the operating company employees or by employees that sit alongside of the operating business, but work very closely, I'd say, in tandem with the operating business, as it is really pushing a lot of the family's initiative going forward in terms of how they define their family office. The second category is the other end of the spectrum, where the family has exited the operating business either recently or many generations prior, and their family office now looks like a pure investment management firm, right? It's managing assets that are no longer tied up in that operating business, and as such, they have more of an asset management framework that they use to kind of execute their vision. I would share to answer your question, like, why do families have them? What we generally see, and would love your thoughts on this too, I mean, we usually see that the shared services component, whether that be some sort of resource that the family uses, like shared tax filings, right, as one example, right, because of the shared interest and ownership of assets becomes very meaningful. The ability to invest alongside of one another, right, the ability to have shared governance, which I know you do a lot of, like, that is usually driving their definition of a family office, some sort of cohesive shared structure that they benefit from and have synergies of acting on this together and in tandem.
The idea of the embedded family office is obviously a natural progression for a family that has liquidity from their operating company. They've got trusted relationships within that operating company, and so they say, "Hey, can you start to do more and more work for me?" And what are some of the challenges? I want to lean into that, because more often than not, I see a lot of the embedded family offices talk to me about the challenges that you see from an embedded perspective, because I think there's quite a few.
Quite a few. The first one is we see the operating company, usually someone in a C-suite role, is started to become what we call trusted advisor to the family members, right? And they are starting to spend a portion of their time, usually called the CFO or the COO, a portion of their time on joining a trust and estate planning meeting, for instance, collecting K-1s, which is a tax filing that you receive for alternative investments, right? So we start to see that they just, because of the fact that they're a trusted confidant and advisor for the family, because they're in the operating business, they get pulled in to roles outside of their day-to-day. Once we see that individual spending about 25 to 50% of their time on non-operating business initiatives, is usually when either the family or that individual raise their hand and say, we have to consider some sort of potential change or formalization around our family office, because this isn't sustainable if the family operating business is still going to require a lot of this person's time.
Janet, this is probably pretty granular, but how does a family have that conversation? Because I can also see that being a difficult conversation, or how does that individual have that conversation with the family, tee this up? Like, how can you create a moment for that individual to raise their hand and say, pause for a second?
Yeah, I mean, I should share, it's usually more the family saying something than it is the individual.
Okay.
For this reason, I think that those individuals, and it makes sense, right? You get flattered if you're being pulled into matters outside the operating business, right? Because that shows that you're this trusted advisor for the family. So usually they actually don't want to let go of those responsibilities because it's an honor and it's a badge of honor for them. It is usually more often than not the family recognizing, and it's actually more often than not someone outside the operating business, honestly, a family member that's on the board, but maybe not running the operating business day to day, that says, wait a minute, I'm also giving this workload to this individual. And if all of us sitting around this table are asking that same thing, how are they possibly spending over 50% or 75 or 80 or 90% of their time on the operating business? So usually someone from the outside starts to recognize that. Sometimes it's a time lag of, issues that they don't get back to them on certain issues because, again, they have a lot on their plate. Sometimes nowadays, it's a lot of times around retirement, because they're reaching an age where they realize they need to backfill that role. And then they start to see all of the tasks that person was undertaking or overseeing. But it's, and then the third piece is, you'll have a family member outside the operating business that may want to initiate more of a formal family office structure because they are bringing expertise to the table outside the operating business. And they just recognize from a resource perspective that this has been happening for a long time and that workload has increased, and they want to figure out a way to segregate the functions, or at least, formalize who's doing what and why within the operating business versus outside the operating business in the family office.
So if a family gets to that point and they're going to formalize this, let's talk about like tactical steps. What does a family go through? What does that look like?
The first thing is to figure out who is doing these tasks, right? So if it is someone in the operating business, what tasks are on their plate, getting them to actually list out the non-operating company roles that they're filling or tasks that they're doing, and how many hours of their day that is on average taking, or month or year. Asking that alone, the little bit of a process. Sometimes you're prying this out of administrative assistants, accountants, right? So you're going across the whole operating business, but really understanding who is doing what is paramount. And a lot of times this is outside of the operating business too, right? It's service providers. So who is doing what, and what sort of time and commitment and financial commitment the family is making for that resource to be serving in that role. So first we want to look at, and we actually, in our firm, we produce a ton of workflows, right? We actually say, okay, this person is doing this. Whenever they receive this document, they email this lawyer, or they call the CPA firm and they tell them this information. We produce workflows to try to understand who the interested parties are and how much time each task is actually taking them on a day-to-day basis to see if you're going to recreate this or formally segregate it, what staff you would need. Because once you have dedicated staff to a family office that's focusing 100% of their time on your family office, their efficiencies are going to be different. Their workload is going to be very different. So you need to figure out, okay, what tasks are being done in the background here that we need to formalize, and what's the cost and the time and the commitment that we should make to that as a family. That is step one. Who's doing what and why? Step two is we call more of a cost and budget analysis and a resource analysis. So a lot of times families may not want to necessarily add employees outside the operating business, right? Because then they're managing a second business. Okay, how do you take away a task that someone in the operating business is doing if you don't want to add an employee? Right. You can add an external provider, right? So figuring out what are the options here for all of these workloads, who can be fulfilling them on a regular basis and a continual basis to take, again, the brunt of that work off the operating company employees and put them more on the family office. Okay. And that is a full org structure exercise in terms of and cost of that resource, the training that could be required of that person, and then what service provider or external options are available if you decide to go down that route. Okay. And then the third step is the getting everyone on board, right? So that's
the easy part of implementing all of that. Okay. So let's go to, I think it's probably step two in some ways. It's looking at, and this is the $100 million question that everybody talks about is, okay, what is the threshold for actually saying, yes, we should be creating a single family office for our family versus looking at all their alternatives, a multifamily office? What's your perspective on that, and how does that analysis go? Is that just part of the costing structure?
So it's more qualitative than quantitative, to be honest. The families that approach us have ranged from 1 to 200 million in net worth up to billions, and there's generally no correlation between whether or not they want to have an office, how they want to staff that office, to the level of assets and the fact whether or not there's an operating business still involved. It usually boils down to who do they need to be responding to them on a 24/7 basis, if anyone. So the turnaround time is huge for these families, right? So we've seen this from a legal perspective quite a bit, definitely from accounting and bill pay perspective. They don't want mistakes, but they also don't want to have to wait weeks or months to get a response. And on the investment side, yes, also quite a bit, right? Like we'll tell families an MFO would be a great option. And then they'll say, okay, so I can send them one deal a day I'm looking at and expect them to underwrite it. And we're like, well, not every MFO will do that for you. So it's trying to align the expectations that the family has, and it's usually not correlated with the cost structure. I would share that for investment professionals, under 500 usually does not make a lot of sense, and that you're going to have a lot of selection bias in that pool, right? The investment professionals. So we're hiring a CIO right now for our family office. And one of the first questions I get from everyone who's interested is, what is the amount of AUM that I'm going to be able to deploy or manage, right? So it's very, to attract top talent, they're going to want to know that number. And the family won't want to probably spend to have a dedicated resource if that's going to, to be honest, like you just eat into their returns from a cost perspective. Right. And also keep in mind that's one individual. So whenever you're doing this org chart, every role you're hiring for, that's one person. If you have one lawyer on staff, the chances that they know every single answer without going to an outside expert is very slim. So with all of these models, we tell families, like, at the end of the day, you're going to be in a hybrid position, right? You're going to have internal resources that are 24/7, but you're going to still need to rely very heavily on experts and develop that network with the people you have in place to effectuate efficient communication and use them as best necessary. But you're going to want all of those service providers as well in the mix.
Makes sense. Oftentimes what I see is the challenge with the family interacting with the office. And if I think about that CIO coming in, and whether they have the autonomy to make investment decisions versus the family calling the shots, how do you see that playing itself out? How do you advise families and their advisors on creating clarity around who has the decision rights? How is this going to operate so that everybody understands kind of the rules of the game?
Yeah, it's a good quote. Good question. Good point. I would share that most families we work with, not every single family member uses the office or is maybe utilizing the office as much as the other family members are. So it's never like not all parties usually created equal.
Sure.
And a lot of times it's the female members, to be honest. They're busy, they have other things going on. So there's one family we're working with where the family office head will tell me, he's like, I just don't think they're interested in this investment opportunity. I don't want to waste their time with it. They don't show up, they don't answer the emails. They don't show up to all the calls. And I'm like, well, that doesn't mean that they're not interested. It just means they're going to be more difficult to potentially engage. But engaging everyone is really important because the offices that then end up revolving around just the person who proactively uses the office the most are the ones that also ultimately end up, potentially going in different directions down the road because the other family members just don't feel like they have the same level of engagement and level of interest and involvement, and they just don't see what's been happening at the office. So it's a big challenge for staff and one that we spend a lot of time on with them. Big things are upfront communication, understanding of like who's doing what, introducing, like getting family members into the office as much as possible or in front of those staff as much as possible. So even if you're having a board meeting and you're discussing items that you don't want the staff to maybe be involved in, let them sit in the very beginning when everyone's walking in and just doing introductions, make them visibly known to the family members and make sure that everyone knows this is what their role is by CCing them in on emails, by and the family office head usually is in this position, right? They have to make sure, okay, if it's bill pay questions, this is the person who's doing all of that. So you should be going directly to them, but they need to kind of proactively push that resource out into the office. But family meetings and board meetings are the easiest way to kind of get the lineup, at least in front of the family members, so they know who's doing what. And the engagement, though, is certainly an issue as these families become larger and there's more people involved.
Yep. Talk to me about the staffing trends that you're seeing and how the use of technology is having an impact or not on how you staff up a family office.
So I'll hit the first one. So staffing, every time we go out to the market in our network and say we are hiring for a family office, on the investment side, we will get flooded. And I mean flooded, we will have to go into hiding. We have so much interest because everyone wants to invest for a family office, right? That just seems to be, and to be honest, it makes sense, right? Like private equity, hedge fund, the market is really challenging from a capital raise perspective. There's a ton of mid-level talent out there on the street. This is, across the board. So if you want to hire on the investment side and you want to poach from the buy side, especially people who are making direct investments, this is probably the best time we've ever seen to do that. And it'll probably just continue that way, at least for the foreseeable future. On the non-investment side, really, really tricky. Depends on the level of role. Accountants are really difficult to hire, really difficult to source. And this is across the board, right? It's not just it's an industry-wide issue. So to answer your second question, we love trying to get tech into the mix when we're hiring or when we're building out an accounting function as much as possible. It's still difficult to avoid some manual entry in Excel and some sort of, additional checks and balances and oversight completely if you're a really complex family that has a lot going on. But you can certainly augment what's there and at least make it we have one family we work with, it's one bookkeeper tracking 95 bank accounts because there's a general ledger system, there's an automatic bill pay system, and there's an investment reporting system that actually aggregates all of the bank accounts into one place. So that is hugely helpful, for an in-house staff, and you can get away with a junior or less experienced hire and augment through tech. Administration is another one that we're seeing that's really, really difficult again to staff. It's a hard seat, right? It's 24/7. You're getting asked to do a lot of different things, and the level of everything from organizing a meeting with an attorney to collecting tax documents to then getting lunch for a meeting. I mean, the task just really run the gamut. So there, it takes a certain person and personality to do that role. And in certain markets, that can be a really challenging one to staff. So I guess short answer, investment side, no issues, non-investment, you got to get
Good luck.
Yeah.
Our mutual friend, I had Brian Adams on a while back, and we talked about the need for EQ and the need to be to want to serve and be a service provider for a family, because it isn't just about executing a role. You also have to understand the family and the dynamics and be ready for that, because it's different. It's not an investment house.
Non-investment health. And I love Brian's specs. I love the Mac International specs because they are very comprehensive in covering all of the real responsibilities that will be placed on an executive. And I think to your and Brian's point, I mean, that is spot on, right? There's so many individuals want to come in and just invest and may not realize that if you don't have non-investment staff or systems in place, you're probably going to be doing a lot more than just investing.
So if I think about 80-20, what if you were to work with a client, somebody comes to you, says, hey, we're going to set this up, what would be the 20% that you do, the best practices to get 80% of the results and success within a family office? And then I want to flip that to, what are the couple red flags or things to watch out for in building your family office?
So, I mean, my go-to is checklist, right? Like I'm really big on like checklist manifesto for every firm that I've worked for. And I think it applies honestly very cleanly over to a family office, right? Again, who is doing what and what are they actually doing with the information they receive? And does everyone know that that is the workflow that person's following? Because family offices, I mean, capture so many different files, emails, and items and miscellaneous text and requests on a daily basis, right? Yeah. So I think that a lot of times the family members, one, don't see that range, and they don't understand that there are many, many different steps that the individual has to follow for each item, depending on the nature of what comes in. So I'm really big on creating those checklists also because, a lot of times they're thinly staffed offices, right? So they're 1 people, they're 2 people, they're 3 people. And if that person is out on vacation for 2 weeks, the work doesn't stop, right? Especially in family office world. So you need to make sure that someone can just pick up that checklist and know exactly what to do with it, or the service provider that's doing that knows exactly what to do with that information, and everyone feels like things can keep running smoothly. The other 20% I'd say is the hiring piece is huge, right? So whether you're going to go internal or external, thoroughly vetting and using an objective process is really important, right? So, everything from asking for references to actually testing the service provider or employee's acumen in certain areas of the family office. Like, I mean, I say like hedge funds, I mean, you go through like 7-8 rounds of tests before you even meet with anyone on an investment team. Like you have to keep one as objective as possible as long as you can, because once there's a relationship there, that is what's most important, right, to the family and the culture piece. So you want to make sure by the time they form that relationship that you feel really good that the employee or the service provider can actually do that work. And then the red flags. And the big thing to kind of watch out for is, lack of response time in an employer or service provider is usually telling you that that person has too much on their plate, or they can no longer serve you as a client or a family. And I think that families, I see let that piece go on way too long before they make a change. And but as soon as you start seeing that lag, okay, let's try to figure out what's wrong here. And if your sense of urgency is not going to change, but that other person's is different, because again, they're usually overloaded with work. In the family office industry as a whole, good service providers are I mean, good T&E attorneys, good accountants, as you know, I mean, they are inundated with workflow right now. So we're really making sure, okay, again, if this is important to you and response time is important to you, trying to figure out how you should make a change and mistakes. I mean, we have counterparties that will just make mistakes from time to time. And by the third mistake, you should probably be making a real change, because you should be careful about, where you're sending wires and what checks and balances are in place, and are those being followed by the service provider, right? Or was a bill missed? Like, sure, everyone can make, a mistake every now and then, but you want to make sure it's rectified and it won't happen again. And I see families far too often. I mean, they'll give people years, people or service providers. And then it becomes like, oh, now we have to make a very abrupt change, which is not ideal, I think, for either party.
Well, and I would imagine these are individuals who everybody in the family has gotten to know quite well. There is a relationship there. And so breaking up is hard. And they don't want to do it. There's a lot of friction in bringing somebody new in and onboarding them. And while that may happen very often in their operating company, if they have one, the idea of going through that with their family is a daunting task.
That, or you have a generational change.
Yes.
And the relationship was with the prior generation, or the generation who's retiring or no longer actively involved. But to your point, even the generation stepping in wants to be very respectful of that relationship. And I mean, we see there is a real cost to that, right? I mean, there is a financial cost in a lot of cases to not making that change. So understanding and recognizing the importance of a relationship, but you still have the opportunity to provide feedback, right? I mean, if that relationship's important to you, it's probably very important to that person. So if they get candid and transparent feedback about it, and still can't do anything, a lot of times some of these service providers, especially the big banks, they're like, this is the way we're structured. We can't do anything about it. And it's not about the advisor, it's about the infrastructure they're in. So just trying to recognize that, having a transparent conversation about it, at least, just understand if it's worth making a change down the road, is a good place to start.
Janet, succession planning within a family office and how the family is involved. Any thoughts on best practices or things that families could or should be considering as they're going through that? Because there will be a lot of them going through that in the next couple of years.
Yeah, so there's two levels of that. There's a succession planning for the family's involvement, and there's a succession planning for the family office staff. I'll hit the second one first, and then it kind of ties into the first. So for staff, what we are seeing is, because the industry is mature, but still kind of growing and expanding, a lot of these offices, the staffing has ramped up very quickly over the past 5 to 10 years, which means that the person who may be retiring was probably doing the job by themselves or with a very small team. And now they have a team of 50 or 100 people. But they are still this like nexus and encyclopedia of information that you can't separate from easily. Multi-year plans is huge. The professional needs to recognize if they're going to retire and actually put a timeline in place. Mm-hmm. And the family needs to push them on that timeline, honestly, as much as possible, and stick to it, because the training and knowledge transfer, I mean, 3 to 5 years is a good bogey and benchmark, right? But we see offices trying to do it in 6 to 12 months, and it's really, really challenging. And sometimes it's because they have no other choice, because there was a health issue or, sudden change where there was a relocation, something like that. And all of a sudden they're backfilling very quickly. If retirement's coming, the family should say something, the executive should say something. We are seeing this role getting split up into multiple roles. I think where we've seen some issues is where it's like, okay, it's going to be one role again. And we've really told families, like, it was one role, but keep in mind it's because that person learned over 20 years and they became very efficient at all these other things. Do you want to take another 20 years to find someone and train them up to that person? Or do you want to take 2 to 3 years to find a team to fill that role. And it may not be a cost issue. It's just a matter of like, do you want to manage more than one person, right?
Yep.
And on the first point with the family, so we work with mostly G2 plus. So more often than not, the person who's calling us up is a family member that is tasked with or raised their hand to take over the family office. And that person, you need one person. I guess in all situations, it generally comes down to one individual of the brand or the generation coming in that is saying, I want to optimize this office and I feel very passionate about a certain asset class or area of the business that I want to focus on, or something where they want to take their expertise and kind of run with it and use the office and use that to really grow and develop the office. We're not seeing a very passive generation come in by any means, right? So, but it's usually the loudest and most eager voice that kind of gets tasked with managing. And that actually has worked pretty well in most cases, because you still have governance in place, but you have someone who's accountable for the office, who's a family member that is, that, they're interested, right? They're actually excited and enthusiastic about what the office is doing, and they're taking ownership for it so that everyone else can kind of, okay, this is taken care of, and that person can make sure that our interests remain aligned. But again, it's probably the nature of our business that we usually get the volunteer reaching out or the person tapped with, you need to do this. And having that one individual has been very important.
Single point of contact. Let's talk cybersecurity. Just jump down that rabbit hole, because I know that security in a family office is paramount. What are you seeing? What are you implementing? Because I get that question from others.
Yeah, so we largely tackle it from the accounting front. We have personal services now as well that we just launched, that my team is focusing more on cybersecurity outside of accounting, but my experience is largely in accounting and finance. So I'm going to speak to that. Yep. Wires, bill pay, right? Check fraud is the #1 thing we're seeing, right? And we still have a lot of families that love to be able to sign checks and put them in the mail. There's nothing wrong with that. But check fraud is rampant. I mean, we see this across every office that people, and that's not really speaking directly to cyber, but it's going to dovetail into cyber here in a second. So once you go off of physical checks, you're now down to ACH and wire. Yeah. Wires have been very vulnerable from a cybersecurity perspective. ACH is where the banks are most comfortable. And I like to work with where the banks feel strongest about their cybersecurity, or your counterparty feels strongest about their cybersecurity. So if the banks are recommending you use ACH and there's a mistake from an ACH perspective, the likelihood that they're going to own that for you versus we told you not to use a wire and you used a wire, they're going to be supporting the ACH all day long. But understanding when you're going through a third party, let's use like a bill.com, for example. I mean, there are cybersecurity firms that you could hire to actually test their environment. And this is something that on the hedge fund side, we had to do all the time with every third party because we were handling hundreds and thousands of clients. So good examples of like a Kroll, Duff and Phelps, right? You have them come in and they actually do cybersecurity tests on all of your service providers and come up with vulnerability assessments on them. And if you want to continue being a service provider for family offices, you have to ensure that you kind of meet the same criteria and checkboxes that an asset management firm would have to. So I like using the same groups that you would use if you were managing external outside capital to do that same vulnerability assessment across your service providers.
Why treat it different? Just because you're a family office doesn't mean you should be operating different than a hedge fund that has the same AUM you might have as a family.
Yeah, most of the families are much larger, to your point, than most hedge funds and private equity firms. So yeah, we take that same approach every time.
Basic elements of the tech stack. This is, and let me be clear, we are not promoting anybody. This is not sponsored by anybody, but I am curious. Basic fundamental elements of a tech stack for a family that is looking to build out their family office. What does that look like? Any thoughts?
Most families are pretty tech light to start, and that's not a bad thing. It depends on what you own. right? So if most of your assets are still in your operating business and all of your accounting is being handled by that operating business, do you really need a lot of reporting and technology outside the operating business? It just depends on what the complexity looks like outside of that. Oftentimes, more likely than not, the answer may be no, if you have that system built in your operating business. I will say, once you own a lot of listed securities across multiple accounts, or once you just have multiple bank accounts, I mean, 20, 30, again, we see hundreds in some cases, aggregating all of that into one place is extremely important. There are many tools that can do that, but having an aggregation of all of the accounts in one place in one snapshot is huge. We love technology for collecting tax information, right? 1099s are really easy to get. K1s much less so. Great if you can also get all your capital calls and statements in one place. That's super important as well. But technology for data collection and aggregation for the importance of tax filing can be very important. Your tax accountants can get into these systems directly too, which is great. I mean, in some cases, we have tax accountants that will just go into the portals and collect them. But if there are a lot of alternatives, they may say, I need to access, you need to get a portal to aggregate everything and then give me access to that. But data aggregation from a document collection perspective, very important. And then the last thing I'll say is that the bill pay technology, this is going to sound really simple, but payroll, even if you have household employees, right? Even if your bill pay is just a handful of bills a month, that's like your country club and your landscaper, right? And you're like, that's not really that complex, right? Over time, everyone's bill pay gets more expensive, and there are more and more people that have bills that are getting paid. A lot of those bills are tax related. So putting in some sort of simple bill pay system or tech is also a place that we really like families to go early on, because otherwise you're going to lose a lot of the ability to kind of look across the whole system and make sure everything actually got paid and to the right people. And when it comes to taxes and tax reporting, it'd be very important.
Perfect. Janet, any parting thoughts, words of wisdom, if for the audience, on what your experience has shown you about starting a family office or continuing to operate one?
So we see some offices really dive into the investment kind of head first, right? And they'll say, I think I need a family office, so I'm going to hire a lot of people and invest a lot of money in technology, and I'm going to stand up a small private equity firm or hedge fund, or a large private equity firm or hedge fund, essentially almost overnight. And overnight could be 6 to 12 months, right? That's really quick. And then they look at that, what they stood up years down the road, and say, wow, like, I really haven't used all this technology. I really didn't need all those people, because I thought I was going to make investments, but I didn't. And I thought I was going to need this function area covered for my family, but I didn't. And so I say it's really tough to unwind that, right? People, certainly. But even these systems, I mean, it's really difficult to then say, okay, now I'm just going to go back to something more simple or manual. So every decision you make can be clunky to unwind in reverse. So just try to be thoughtful, and we say kind of build from the bottoms up, right? You can always add senior people, but just make sure your bases are covered. Yeah,
good. Janet, thank you so much. It's really helpful. It's the family office space is growing exponentially every year, and there are more and more family offices. And so being able to understand some of the basics and best practices is really appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you all for joining us here at Family.Inc. I would encourage you to check out Family.Inc for more resources, interviews for enterprising families. Additionally, after this discussion, we're going to have an email sent out asking for your feedback. I hope you'll participate. Thank you very much and have a great day. Take care.